My name is Simone Carter. I'm 26 years old. While my younger brother was handed a full ride, a brand new SUV, and the deed to a downtown loft, I worked 2 jobs just to keep the heat running in a studio apartment with a leaking radiator. My parents called it building character. They called his life an investment. I called mine survival. The night everything changed, I was working a catering shift at a corporate mixer after finishing a full day upstairs in the marketing department. I'd been on my feet since 5 that morning when a man in a charcoal suit stepped between me and the drinks table. He studied my name badge, then my face, like he'd been searching for both for a long time. "Did they ever have you sign a family tax form?" he asked. "Before I go further, if you're new here, consider tapping subscribe. This channel exists because of viewers like you, and it genuinely helps us keep telling these stories." The question knocked the wind out of me. At 18, my father had slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table and told me it was routine. I signed without reading a word. The man's face hardened. He opened his briefcase and showed me a single page bearing my grandfather's seal, my full legal name, and a number large enough to make my hand shake. Before I could finish reading, he closed it. "They never told you who the actual heir was, did they?" I wanted to laugh in his face. I wanted to call him a liar. Instead, I thought about every bill my parents claimed they couldn't help me with, and every extravagant gift they somehow always found the money for when it came to my brother. The man handed me a sealed envelope and told me not to confront anyone yet. 4 days later, my parents called me in a panic. "Please come home. We need you." By then, it was already too late. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I like knowing how far these stories travel. For most of my life, I believed the gap between my brother and me was something I'd caused. My father, Robert, used to say Malcolm was built for bigger things, while my mother, Diane, reminded me I was practical and less likely to waste money. When I was younger, those words almost sounded like compliments. It took years to understand what they really meant. Malcolm was allowed to dream, and I was expected to absorb the cost. When I was 15, I won a regional business plan competition and came home holding a plaque I'd polished with my sleeve. My parents barely glanced at it because Malcolm had made a walk-on spot on a college soccer roster. We ordered his favorite takeout that night. My plaque ended up in a kitchen drawer. At 18, I got into a university with a strong marketing program. My parents sat me down and explained the family couldn't stretch far enough to help both of us. Malcolm, they said, needed the full experience, the dorm, the campus life, the connections. I could commute from home, work part-time, and transfer in later. 2 weeks after that conversation, they bought him a car, so he wouldn't have to take the bus. I took the bus to my morning classes, worked afternoons at a copy shop, and answered phones at a dental office 3 evenings a week. I told myself the grind was making me stronger. That was how they trained me to translate neglect into character. By 26, I'd finished my degree, landed a junior marketing role at Ashford Media Group, and kept a second job at a hotel front desk 4 nights a week. My paycheck covered rent, student loans, groceries, and whatever emergency showed up that month. I owned 3 pairs of work shoes and knew to the day how long a jar of peanut butter would last. Malcolm, meanwhile, dropped out of college 1 semester short of graduating, announced that traditional education stifles innovation, and talked our parents into bankrolling a tech startup that had no paying customers and a homepage full of promises. They covered the deposit on his loft, upgraded his car again, and treated every half-finished idea like proof of genius. At family dinners, my mother would ask if I was still doing that little marketing thing. My father would suggest I smile more if I wanted a raise. Malcolm would talk about taking his company international, despite never having closed a single sale. I rarely pushed back. Every time I tried, my mother would sigh and say, "Why does everything have to turn into a competition with you?" And I'd end up apologizing for a competition I never started. The one person who ever took my ambitions seriously was my mother's father, Elijah Marsh. He built Marsh Logistics Group from a single rented warehouse into a company that owned distribution centers, office parks, and manufacturing plants across 3 states. When I was young, he let me sit next to him while he went through invoices. He never once talked down to me. He asked what I noticed. He listened to the answer. The summer before college, I worked in one of his warehouses and suggested a simple color-coded shelving system to cut down on picking errors. He rolled it out company-wide and mailed me a handwritten note afterward. Good leaders notice what everyone else has learned to ignore. He passed away the following spring. After the funeral, my parents said the estate was complicated and that most of the company had been placed under temporary family management. Malcolm was told he might get a future role. I was told not to worry about business matters while I focused on school. My Uncle Terence, my mother's older brother, argued with my parents in the hallway that day. I only caught fragments through the closed door. Not what he intended. Fiduciary duty. She deserves to know. A week later, Terence stopped showing up to family events entirely. My mother said he'd grown bitter over the will. My father called him dangerous. Malcolm joked that every wealthy family needs one jealous relative. I accepted their version because I had no other one to compare it to. The invitation to Ashford's client mixer arrived after I quietly salvaged a campaign a senior manager had botched. My supervisor, Denise, insisted I attend, telling me the event would put me in front of executives from Marsh Logistics, which had recently become one of our biggest accounts. I almost said no, since my hotel shift started before the mixer ended, but Denise talked my hotel manager into letting me come in late. I thought the invite was finally proof my work was being noticed. What I didn't know was that Terence had spotted my name on Ashford's project roster and specifically requested that every contributor be invited. He hadn't wandered over to me by accident. He'd been looking for a way to reach me without tipping off my parents. And the envelope he pressed into my hand held the first piece of evidence that the unfair life I'd been living wasn't unfair at all. It had been engineered. I didn't open the envelope at the mixer. Terence asked me to wait until we were somewhere private, and the tension in his voice made the room feel suddenly unsafe. We slipped out a side door and found an empty conference room on another floor. He locked the door, set his briefcase on the table, and pulled out several folders stamped with dates going back 6 years. "Before you read any of this," he said, "I need you to know I didn't stay away because I forgot about you." His voice tightened. "I stayed away because your parents threatened to accuse me of interfering with the estate if I contacted you before your trust matured. I thought the court process would protect you on its own. I was wrong." I opened the envelope. The first document was a certified excerpt of my grandfather's will. It named me as the primary beneficiary of the Marsh Legacy Trust. On my 26th birthday, I was set to receive control of 55% of the voting shares in Marsh Logistics Group, plus income from 3 commercial properties. Until then, my parents had been named temporary trustees, permitted to draw from the trust only for my education, health, and reasonable living expenses. Malcolm was named separately. He was entitled to a modest cash gift at 28, on the condition he either finished a degree or worked full-time for 6 straight years. He'd done neither. I read the pages twice because the words wouldn't sit still long enough to feel real. "This says they were supposed to be paying for my school," I whispered. Terence didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid an account statement across the table. It listed distributions from my trust during the exact years my parents insisted there was no money for tuition. The line items were vague: educational support, beneficiary housing, transportation, professional development, but the addresses and account numbers weren't mine. One payment matched the price of Malcolm's first car. Another matched the down payment on his loft. A string of transfers had gone to the LLC registered under his startup's name. More than $265,000 had disappeared over 6 years. My hands went numb. Real quick, if this story is pulling you in, this is exactly the kind of channel worth sticking around for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. "Maybe this counts as family expenses," I said, hearing how badly I wanted it to be true. Terence shook his head. "The trust doesn't authorize family expenses. It authorizes expenses for you." He laid out copies of annual notices mailed to an address I'd never lived at, each one signed for by someone using my name. Then he produced the document my father had me sign at 18. The visible page was a routine tax authorization. Underneath, in a copy I'd never seen, was a waiver acknowledging I'd received full disclosure of the trust and approved discretionary distributions on my own behalf. My signature was on the final page. The witness signature belonged to my mother. "I never saw this," I said. "I signed a stack." Dad had his hand over the pages, pointing at the lines. Terrence nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected." He'd spent years requesting independent audits. My parents stalled, switched accountants, and used their seats on the company's interim board to keep the records locked down. When my trust matured 2 months earlier, the voting shares should have transferred to me automatically. Instead, my father had filed a statement claiming I'd declined active ownership and appointed him as my continuing proxy. The signature on that statement wasn't even a close match to mine. Something in me shifted from confusion into a cold, exact kind of anger. Every night at the hotel desk, every skipped meal, every time I'd been told I lacked gratitude, my hardship hadn't just happened alongside their favoritism, it had funded it. They'd watched me struggle while spending money that was legally mine, then praised Malcolm for living well off what they'd taken. "Why would Grandpa put it all on me?" I asked. Terrence opened a smaller envelope, holding a letter in my grandfather's handwriting. "He'd chosen me," it said, "because I worked without needing applause, because I asked about employees before I asked about profit, and because I understood the difference between owning something and deserving to be its steward." He deliberately capped Malcolm's inheritance after watching my parents excuse his recklessness one too many times. "Your grandfather was afraid they'd build Malcolm's life by tearing down yours," Terrence said. "The trust was built to stop exactly that." I stared at the letter until the ink blurred. For years, I'd wondered what was wrong with me. Now I had a different question. How many times had my parents looked me in the eye and chosen the lie all over again? Terrence warned me not to confront them yet. If they realized I had the documents, they could move assets, destroy records, or pressure me into signing another release. He'd already reached out to Renee Booker, an attorney who specialized in trust litigation, and a forensic accountant named Marcus Dunn. They needed my authorization to pull the full records and request an emergency freeze. I was terrified. Going after my own parents felt like stepping off a roof and trusting the ground would rise to meet me. "What happens if I do nothing?" I asked. Terrence looked at the statement spread across the table. "They keep control. Malcolm keeps what they bought him. And they learn your silence is the safest asset they'll ever own." That answer made the decision for me. I signed the authorization, but this time, I read every line. The next morning, I went to work with copies of everything locked inside my bag. I'd slept maybe an hour, and yet my head felt sharper than it had in years. Denise noticed right away and called me into her office, asking if I was coming down with something. I almost told her everything. But Terrence had warned me that my parents still had influence over Marsh Logistics' account with Ashford. One loose conversation could reach them before our legal filing was even ready. I told Denise I had a family matter and asked for 2 personal days after that afternoon's campaign presentation. She agreed. Then surprised me by saying I'd be the one leading it. The senior manager assigned to the account had taken credit for my strategy, but couldn't explain the numbers when pressed. Denise had gone back through the work history and knew exactly whose idea it had been. For one dizzying moment, my 2 lives collided. At home, people were using my name to take what belonged to me. At work, someone else had been using my ideas for the same reason. Both had assumed I'd stay quiet. I walked into that conference room and delivered the campaign myself. I answered every question, corrected a shaky projection, and locked in approval for the largest phase of the account. When it wrapped, the Marsh Logistics representatives congratulated me, with no idea I legally controlled most of the company they worked for. I didn't say a word. I thanked them, went back to my desk, and opened the secure message from Renee. The emergency petition was ready. At her office that evening, Renee laid out the plan. We'd asked the court to suspend my parents as trustees, freeze the disputed accounts, invalidate the proxy filed under my name, and demand a full accounting of every distribution. Terrence, as alternate trustee and sitting board member, would call an emergency meeting the moment the freeze was granted. Marcus had already traced several transfers straight to Malcolm's loft, his car, and his startup. The evidence was solid, but Renee warned me that solid didn't mean painless. They'll say they acted for the family, she said. They might say you knew. They might come after your stability, your motives, even your relationship with your grandfather. People who've built their whole strategy around your silence rarely go quietly once you find your voice. I signed the petition. The next 48 hours blurred into work, legal calls, and old memories I could no longer read the same way. I remembered my mother demanding I pay her back for a medical bill when I was 21. The trust had reimbursed her for that same bill twice. I remembered my father calling Malcolm's loft proof that bold people make their own opportunities. The down payment had come from an account under my beneficiary number. I remembered Malcolm laughing when I turned down a weekend trip because I couldn't miss a hotel shift. He'd invited me out to a balcony I'd unknowingly paid for. On the third morning, the court granted the temporary freeze. My parents were removed from trust control pending a hearing. The proxy was suspended. Marsh Logistics' general counsel was ordered to preserve every record. Malcolm's startup account, which had received disputed funds, was locked to ordinary operating expenses only. At 10:14, my father called. At 10:16, my mother called. At 10:18, Malcolm texted, demanding to know what I'd done. I watched the screen go dark and stay that way. Then my parents called together from the house line. I answered on speaker, with Renee sitting across from me. My mother was crying. My father sounded like he was forcing every word through clenched teeth. "Please come home," he said. "We need you." No apology, no question about what I'd found out. Just urgency. "Why?" I asked. Silence. Then my mother said the company accounts had been frozen, the board was asking questions, and there were documents that needed my signature. "What documents?" I asked, already knowing the answer. My father took over. "A temporary authorization. This has gone too far. Simone, come home, sign it, and we handle this privately." I looked at Renee. She shook her head once. "I spent 6 years handling my problems privately," I said. "You spent those same years spending my money publicly." My father's voice rose. "Terrence has poisoned you against your own family." "No," I said. "The bank statements did that." My mother begged me not to humiliate them. Malcolm shouted in the background that his company would collapse. I felt the old reflex kick in, calm them down, rescue them, make myself smaller, rising in my chest. Then, I remembered Terrence's warning. My silence had always been their safest asset. "I'll come home tomorrow," I said, "but I'm not signing anything." My father started to protest. I ended the call. 3 days earlier, they'd believed I'd never uncover any of it. Now they needed the daughter they'd spent years training to underestimate. It was already too late. I showed up at my parents' house the next afternoon carrying one folder and wearing the same navy suit I'd worn for the Marsh Logistics presentation. Renee waited in a car 2 blocks away and Terrence stayed reachable by phone. I'd only agreed to the meeting after my parents confirmed in writing that Malcolm would be there and that no documents would be placed in front of me without my attorney present. Those conditions made my father furious, which told me they were exactly the right ones to set. The dining room looked almost frozen in time. Same polished table, same brass light fixture, except now there was a stack of legal notices sitting beside my father's plate. My mother reached for me when I walked in. I stepped past her. Malcolm sat with his arms folded, wearing the watch our parents had given him after his startup got its first round of funding. Funding I now knew had come entirely from my trust. "Let's stop pretending this is a misunderstanding," I said, taking the empty chair across from them. I opened my folder and set 3 account summaries on the table. $310,000 was distributed for my education, housing, transportation, and professional development. I received under $18,000 of it. The rest went to Malcolm or to assets you controlled. My mother looked at the papers without touching them. "We used it for the family," she said. "Your grandfather would have understood. His trust says the opposite." My father leaned in. "Legal language isn't the same as intention. You were stable. You had scholarships. You could work. Malcolm needed a stronger start. I had one partial scholarship. I worked nights because you told me there was nothing left. I paused. And look at you, he said, like my exhaustion proved him right. You turned out responsible. That line hurt worse than any denial could have. He was proud of what their betrayal had forced me to become. I turned to my mother. Did you know the trust reimbursed the medical bill you made me pay back? Her expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Your father handled the accounts, she whispered. I pulled out a copy of the waiver. You witnessed my signature. She started to cry. We thought we'd replace the money before you ever needed it. Malcolm pushed back from the table. Why are you acting like I stole from you? Mom and Dad made those calls. I slid an email printout in front of him, a message he'd sent my father 3 years earlier after a transfer got delayed. If Sam's fund is locked, just pull from the property income. She doesn't even know it exists. The color drained out of his face. That was a joke, he said. It was an email about $55,000, I said. I didn't understand the structure. You understood enough to know it was mine. My father slammed his palm on the table, rattling the glasses. Enough. You're tearing this family apart over money. I looked at him and realized he still thought volume could pass for authority. No. You tore it apart the day you decided one child's future could double as the other child's allowance. My mother finally asked what I wanted. For the first time in my life, all 3 of them were waiting on my answer. Real quick, before we get to how this ends, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. A subscribe would genuinely mean a lot. I laid out the terms Renee had prepared. My parents would resign as trustees and step down from their interim roles at Marsh Logistics. They'd cooperate fully with the audit, return any remaining trust property, and provide a complete written accounting. Malcolm would surrender the vehicle, give up his claim to the trust-funded equity in his loft, and stop pulling disputed money into his company. In return, I'd consider resolving the civil claims without pushing for the maximum penalties available. My father laughed once, sharp and humorless. You think you can walk in here and take everything? I'm asking you to return what you took. Malcolm accused Terrence of manipulating me to seize control of the company. I told him Terrence had already signed an agreement barring himself from taking any additional compensation or shares during the case. My father called the paperwork a bluff. My mother begged me to remember the birthdays, the holidays, every meal she'd cooked. Were those acts of love? I asked. Or payments you expect me to accept instead of the truth? No one answered. My father stood and told me if I kept going, he'd make sure the board heard I was unstable, vindictive, and unqualified. He said Ashford would hear I'd exploited confidential client information. Malcolm threatened to tell the extended family I was trying to bankrupt our parents. My mother said nothing, which felt like agreement. I closed the folder. You have until Monday morning to accept the terms. And if we don't, my father asked, then the audit goes to the board, the court, and every institution entitled to see it. I walked to the door. Behind me, Malcolm said I'd regret choosing money over family. I turned back once. I chose the truth. You chose the money years ago. They rejected the terms before midnight. By Sunday morning, my father had already called 3 board members, describing me as an emotional young woman being manipulated by a bitter uncle. Malcolm posted a long message online, claiming I'd launched a legal attack out of jealousy over his success. Several relatives repeated his version without asking me a single question. My mother sent private messages saying she loved me, while warning that my actions could wreck my father's health and ruin Malcolm's future. The strategy was obvious now. Turn their choices into my guilt. This time, I didn't defend myself in public. Renee advised me to save every message and let the record speak for itself where it could actually carry consequences. Monday morning, the emergency board meeting opened at 9. I walked into the Marsh Logistics headquarters beside Terrence, Renee, and Marcus. My father was already seated at the head of the table, the same chair my grandfather used to sit in. My mother sat beside him. Malcolm had no board seat, but my father brought him in anyway as a future stakeholder. General counsel asked him to leave. He refused until security walked him out to the lobby. Marcus presented the audit for nearly 2 hours. He traced every distribution, matched it against invoices, and flagged the falsified descriptions entered into the trust records. The loft had been logged as beneficiary housing. Malcolm's car had been listed as transportation for university attendance. Payments into his startup had been disguised as professional development. For me, my father had approved the transactions. My mother had countersigned most of them. They'd even billed legal fees to the trust to fund their own refusal to hand Terrence any records. Then Marcus revealed the transfer that ended any remaining pretense of misunderstanding. Less than an hour after the court freeze went into effect, my father had attempted to move $75,000 out of a property income account into a newly formed consulting company. The bank blocked it. The company was registered to Malcolm. My father called it an emergency measure to protect operations. General counsel called it a likely violation of the court order. When the presentation ended, Renee submitted the certified will and the order suspending my father's proxy. The company's secretary confirmed the voting shares now had to be recognized in my name. I'd walked into that room as the daughter they described as unqualified. I walked out holding the controlling vote. I didn't give a speech. I moved to remove my father as interim CEO, suspend my mother from the board, install an independent management committee, and authorize full cooperation with the court. Terrence seconded it. It passed. My father stared at me like I'd become someone he didn't recognize. "You have no idea how to run this company," he said. "That's why I appointed people who do." I answered, "Leadership isn't pretending to know everything. It's knowing when your own presence has become the risk." The court hearing 2 weeks later made everything permanent. My parents were removed as trustees for breach of duty and ordered to pay restitution covering the diverted funds, lost investment growth, and legal costs. Liens were placed on their vacation property and investment accounts. The loft was ordered sold unless Malcolm repaid the trust-funded equity within 45 days. He couldn't. His car was surrendered. His startup lost the money keeping it afloat, and an independent review found it had almost no real revenue to begin with. 4 employees were transferred into legitimate roles within Marsh Logistics, so they wouldn't lose their livelihoods over his deception. His company folded shortly after. My parents were also required to sign a statement correcting the false claims they'd made to the board and to Ashford. When Denise received that letter, she called me into her office. I braced for suspicion. Instead, she told me Ashford's records showed I'd never touched confidential Marsh Logistics information outside my assigned work. Senior leadership had reviewed my presentation and promoted me to campaign manager. My father's attempt to torch my career had left behind a written record of exactly how professional I'd been. Malcolm's public story fell apart once the court filings became available to the relatives he'd recruited. Some apologized, others simply disappeared. I learned not to mistake either reaction for loyalty. The heaviest price my family paid wasn't the property or the status, it was losing control of the story. For years they'd decided who was gifted, who was difficult, who deserved support, and who should be grateful for scraps. The audit replaced every label with a number, a date, and a signature. Was I cruel for refusing to bail them out? Or had they simply mistaken my kindness for a resource that could never run dry? I asked myself that the night the judgment came through. Then I thought about the girl counting coins for bus fare while her brother drove a car titled in her own name. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. 8 months later, Marsh Logistics no longer looked like the monument to family image my parents had spent years trying to protect. The independent committee uncovered wastes that went well beyond the trust violations, renegotiated several vendor contracts, and revived a profit-sharing program my grandfather had originally set up for long-term employees. I accepted the role of board chair but turned down the CEO position. I kept my job at Ashford while completing governance training and meeting weekly with department leads. I wanted to actually understand the company before making decisions that touched hundreds of people's lives. The inheritance had given me authority. It hadn't automatically given me wisdom. The restitution payments cleared my student debt and replaced what had been taken from the trust. I moved out of my old apartment, but I didn't go overboard. My first real decision as chair was setting up an education fund for employees juggling night classes and caregiving responsibilities. I named it after my grandfather's handwritten note. Good leaders notice what everyone else has learned to ignore. Terrence stayed on as an advisor for 1 year under strict oversight. He never asked for shares, money, or public credit. Eventually, he admitted that guilt had shaped his choices too. He'd fought my parents through every formal channel he could find, and when they blocked him, he let the distance become an excuse to stay away. I didn't pretend his late return erased the years he was absent. But he'd shown up with evidence instead of promises, and that difference is where the trust between us slowly started to grow. My parents moved out of the big house once the liens took effect. They rented somewhere smaller and now live on income the trust never touched. They weren't left homeless, despite what Malcolm had predicted. They were simply living without the status my money had been quietly propping up. My father sent 3 letters. The first blamed Terrence. The second blamed the pressure of managing the family. The third had one honest sentence in it. I knew the money was yours, and I believed I had the right to decide who deserved it more. I kept that one because it finally named the wound out loud. My mother asked to meet. I agreed, but only after she finished the written accounting and corrected the story with every relative she'd contacted. At the meeting, she apologized without asking me to walk anything back. I told her forgiveness wasn't a door she could knock on once and expect open forever. It would be earned through consistent honesty, respected boundaries, and time. We speak occasionally now. We're not close. That's not a tragedy I'm obligated to fix by myself. Malcolm took a sales job after his company folded. For a few months, he kept sending angry messages, insisting I'd stolen his future. I answered once. A future built on someone else's stolen money was never yours to begin with. As part of the settlement, he signed over what was left of the loft proceeds and issued a correction, admitting the trust had funded his lifestyle. He hasn't apologized directly. Maybe one day he will. My peace doesn't depend on it anymore. People sometimes call what I did revenge. They imagine revenge has to be loud, reckless, destructive. Mine was quiet. I read the documents. I stopped signing what I didn't understand. I let the evidence walk into the rooms where my parents' charm had always shielded them. I took back control without becoming the kind of person who abuses it. Most of all, I stopped rescuing them from consequences they built for me. The last time my father called in a panic, he said, "Please come home. We need you." There was a time those words would have had me sprinting back, sacrificing sleep, money, dignity, anything, just to feel like I belonged. That day, I looked around the boardroom my grandfather had always meant for me to sit in, and I finally understood. Being needed was never the same thing as being loved. I did come home, I told him, just not to the place you expected me to stay in. Then I hung up and walked into the meeting. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If the people who taught you to feel worthless suddenly needed your power to save them, would you hand it back? Or would you finally let the truth decide what they actually deserved? We appreciate every one of you for watching. This story is a work of fiction, created purely for entertainment and dramatic storytelling. If it resonated with you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Sometimes the quiet ones aren't weak. They've just run out of patience, explaining themselves to people who never intended to listen.